is Magic here. Alright, so we learned about William or Bill Sanders James Lovell, also known as Jimmy or Jim Lovell. I like to call him by his formal name, astronaut James Lovell, and Frank Borman. Yes, three American astronauts who in 1968 on Apollo 8 flew to space and orbited the moon. And as they did on Christmas Eve, each astronaut read a verse from Genesis in the Bible. And it was wonderful because it was broadcasted around the world. Now, very interesting that in 1969, Neil Armstrong, Edwin Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins also go to the moon. And Neil Armstrong steps onto the moon and says, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." And of course, Edwin Buzz Aldrin plants his flag on the surface of the moon, this rocky moon. Now, what does that have to do with Apollo 8? Well, then the following year, in 1970, James Lovell, who flew in 1968 on Apollo 8, decides to go again, this time on Apollo 13. On Apollo 13, yes. And they encountered some difficulties and challenges, but miraculously enough, they were able to land on Earth very safely. So thank God for that. There's even a film where Tom Hanks, the actor, yes, the wonderful actor, Tom Hanks plays the role of the astronaut James Lovell. You know, Lovell has the word love in it. James Lovell. Love, Love, and then LL, Lovell. I like that name. And so he went on Apollo 8 and they flew to space, right? That was in 1968. Then 2 years later, 1970, James Lovell goes again, but with other two crewmates, not with Bill Anders and not with Frank Borman. He goes with two other astronauts, and that was on Apollo 13. And there's a movie called Apollo 13, and Tom Hanks plays the role of James Lovell, who flew to space. Remember Christmas Eve 1968, where Bill Anders, James Lovell, and Frank Borman read a verse from Genesis in the Bible. That was on Christmas Eve of 1968. 1969, right? Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins go on Apollo 11. And that was a great success, right? Because they actually landed on the moon and they stepped onto the moon. And then 1970, only James Lovell from Apollo 8 from 1968 goes on Apollo 13. And it was great because of the challenges that they encounter, but they are able to overcome. And then they land back on Earth, right? Very safe. So thank God for that. All right, so what are we going to sing about? We're going to sing 1968 Apollo 8, so we can remember that. And how can we remember these names of these spacecraft? Easily. 1968 Apollo 8. It has an 8 in it. Then 1969 is Apollo 11. Just remember Neil Armstrong. How he says one small step for man and one giant leap for mankind. So it's Apollo 11, from 8 to 11. It was like a giant leap, right? And then 1970, we go to Apollo 13. 13, right? And that's the one with the film. At least try to remember that Tom Hanks plays James, or Jim, Lovell, right? In 1968, three American astronauts flew to space. On Apollo 8, on Apollo 8 of 1968, 1968, three American astronauts flew to space. Three American astronauts flew to space. In 1968, three American astronauts flew to space. On Apollo 8, on Apollo 8 of 1968. In 1968, three American astronauts flew to space. Three American astronauts flew to space. Magical. Then, 1969, Neil Armstrong landed on the moon. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Mike go to the moon. In 1969, 1969, Neil Armstrong lands on the moon. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. In 1969, 1969, on Apollo 11, they land on the moon. 1970, 1970, James Lovell joins Apollo 13. Apollo 13, Apollo 13. Check out the movie Apollo 13. In 1970, 1970, James Lovell joins Apollo 13. Very nice, there's always magic around. I think we can remember Apollo 8. Because what is knowledge? What is education all about? It's for you to learn all these facts and stuff, right? But it's also for you to make connections. So you can try to make connections and connect the astronaut, James Lovell, from Apollo 8 of 1968, joined 2 years later, 1970, Apollo 13. And I think they are able to orbit the moon, but then they encounter the challenges and then they land safely back to planet Earth. Try to remember it like that. Make a story about it. In 1969, in between 1968 and 1970, what do you have in between? 1969. Again, 1969 is in between 1968 and 1970. And that was a great success because Neil Armstrong and Edwin Buzz Aldrin they step onto the moon, they walk on the moon. Buzz Aldrin plants the flag. Neil Armstrong walks on the moon, takes photographs, and says, one small step for man and one giant leap for mankind. All right. There's always magic around. And knowledge is power. So let's keep learning.